Welcome into the teaching time tonight. If this is your first time in a long time, we are in a series, an 8-week series where we're taking an idea that starts on the first pages of the Bible, and the authors have taken this idea and created a pattern, and that pattern repeats on itself again and again as they go through the stories, through the entire story, from the first pages to the last pages. And what we're trying to do each week is take the next step in the story to trace this idea further and further and further. And the theme that we're doing is exile. Now, if you don't have one of these sweet journals, ask your leader to grab you one. There's a few extra that we still have, and you can jump in right along with us. Now, an exile is to be removed from your home and taken to a place that is not your home and forced to live in a place that's not your home. This story paints a picture that you and I live in a world that was originally designed to be our home, but it doesn't operate as our home should have been. And we live in a complex, messed up, complicated, messy, really painful, difficult world to live in sometimes. And sometimes it fills us with all sorts of questions of why is the world the way it is? Why are relationships so hard? Why are friendships so hard? Why is family so hard sometimes? Why is almost everything that I do seemingly really difficult sometimes? Like, why is life so hard? And this theme helps to make sense of that. And one of the things that we're hoping to do during the series is, as we trace this idea through the story, to learn how the authors wrote. Like, see how they put the stories together so that we can learn what they were trying to say. Because if we can see better how they wrote and put the story together, we can see better what they were trying to communicate first to their original people who would have received this story first, and then to us thousands of years later. Because there's specific things that the authors have said, and they wrote their stories in a specific way. And so when we learn how they put the story together, we get to that meaning better. And that leads us to thinking about where we land this week for this week's part of the story.
So Israel has escaped from slavery in Egypt. Then they spend 1 year at Mount Sinai.
This is where they made the covenant with God to obey all of these laws.
Then they wander around the desert for 40 years before they make it to the Jordan River, which is right across from the land God promised them. They're ready to go in. This is where the book of Deuteronomy begins.
And what this book is really is a speech. Moses gives these final words. It's like a pep talk to the new generation of Israel that's about to go into the land. And the speech, it's broken up into 3 large sections.
So Moses begins the first part of the speech with a somber tone because he's highlighting Israel's rebellion and resistance, which has been going on for the last 40 years.
And that sets up the rest of this opening section, which is Moses' challenge to this new generation to be different from their parents and to respond to God's grace with love and obedience. So he reminds them of the 10 commandments, like the basics of the covenant, and then he gives them this very famous line.
Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength.
Now, in Jewish tradition, this is called the Shema, because the first Hebrew word in this line is Shema Yisrael. And this became a very important prayer in Judaism, said twice a day. And it emphasizes the Israelites' exclusive commitment to their God, the one true God who loved them and who rescued them from slavery.
Right, because they're about to go into a land where people are worshiping many other gods.
And Moses thinks that loyalty to the Lord their God is the only way to life. Now, notice these key words in the Shema, listen and love. You're going to find these words all over this opening section of the speech. The word listen in Hebrew means more than just let sound waves come into your ears. It includes the idea of responding to what you hear. So for Israel, this means responding to God's grace by obeying the laws of the covenant.
And then listen is always followed by love.
Yeah, so love is the true motivation for obeying the laws. Israel won't obey without love, and they don't truly love if they don't obey. So there's this tight connection between loving and listening that runs through the entire book. And so Moses tells them that if they do listen and love, they will fulfill their original calling as the family of Abraham, to show all of the nations the wisdom and justice of God, and so become a blessing to them. Now, after all of the laws, Moses warns Israel of the consequences of their obedience or disobedience, or in his words, the blessing or the curse. If they listen and love, they will experience blessing and abundance in the land, and if they don't, there's going to be famine and plagues, and they'll be forced off their land into exile.
And that brings us to the final section of his speech.
Yeah, here Moses says, I set before you today life or death, blessing or curse. So choose life. But then things get really interesting, because after 40 years with these people, Moses knows they're not going to obey, and so he predicts their failure and even their future exile from the promised land. And he focuses on what he thinks is the true source of the problem, that they have hard and selfish hearts. It's as if Israel is incapable of truly loving God in a way that brings about obedience.
But this problem isn't unique to Israel.
Yeah, in fact, Moses, when he's using this language about blessing and curse, he's tying Israel's story all the way back to all humanity's story from Genesis 1 through 3.
So Adam and Eve, they were blessed by God just like Israel, and given a choice to trust and obey God like Israel.
And then they rebelled and brought a curse on the land, like Moses knows Israel is going to do. And so these stories, they're about Israel's hard heart, but they're actually a window into the universal human condition.
But Moses doesn't give up hope entirely.
That's right. He says that somehow, on the other side of Israel's exile, God promises to transform their heart so that one day they truly can listen and love.
Now, in a moment, we're going to jump into looking at our text and looking at key words and journeying through it. But before we get there, this week's part of the story, if you've read it already, or if you're going to read it this week as you read through this journal, it's kind of a complex part of the story. And if you're asking yourself as you work through these stories, like, what does this story tell me about who God is, what he's like, how he wants to work in this world? When you read stories where he sends an evil empire to Israel to conquer them and take them into captivity and exile them from the home that he gave them, that involves a lot of death and carnage and pain and craziness. And you get done with those stories and you're like, man, what am I supposed to do with that? How am I supposed to deal with that complex picture of who God is and how he deals in the world? I have two things to put in here, and then we'll look in the text. First, man, I am so thankful that this story is complex and doesn't give you and me simplistic answers, and it doesn't paint a simplistic picture of how the world works. Because you and I don't live in a simplistic world. And our world around us is complex. And there are people around the world who don't have food and who are starving. And there's countries in chaos. And there's a global pandemic happening. And life is difficult in so many different ways. And so if this story was super simplistic and didn't deal with the complexities of life, it would be too simple for our real day-to-day life. And second, how do we read difficult passages in the Bible? There's lots of places that are difficult. What do? So first, you want to look at the details and find out what the original author is trying to communicate. So do some things to really start paying attention to the details, read the story. You know, like this journal has a rhythm to really help you do that really well. We've built this so that you can start understanding the story for how the author is telling it. And so number two, try to understand their time and place. Like, what is life like for the people and the author who's telling the story? That will help you get to understand more of the story. And three, we are not the only people who have read this story and had these questions. And so there's lots of smart people over thousands of years who have entered into this story and thought about it and wrote. And so we should go and look at what other smart people have to say about the story that we're reading. 4, consider all the things that we put. So if you read multiple people, chances are they're not going to say the exact same thing. So you're like, okay, this is an idea, this idea, put it all down. And you're like, okay, there's some options of how to make sense of this difficult story here. Okay, I'm getting it. And then consider those options and then go talk to other people. We are so much better when we engage this story together and we discuss what is being communicated to us together. Hope you have your piece of paper and a pen and something else. If you have markers, how fun is that? So we are going to jump in. There's two pieces to our story today. So this first part is where Moses is talking to the group of people who are about to go into the land that God has promised. And these are his final words to them. And then we're going to zoom forward in the story, lots of years, to the place where God needs to step in to these people because they continue to reject him, and he has been patient, and he needs to come and interrupt how evil they are becoming and step in and send them into exile. And so with that, let's jump in. So Moses is stepping in. And when all these things come upon you, to this group of people, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord God has driven you. So he thinks these people are going to reject God. He doesn't really have high hopes for them. He thinks they're going to rebel and be taken into captivity. Return to the Lord there. You and your children obey his voice. Now remember, that's listen. Listen to his voice. From the beginning, that's what this is all about. Are we going to listen to God's voice, or are we going to listen to somebody else's voice? And all that I command you today, with all your heart and with all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have mercy on you, and he will gather you again. There is this hope while they are in exile. While they live in exile, if they return and listen to his voice, every time the promise is, whether they are being punished or whether they are living in the blessing and about to experience it, it's all about this. Whose voice are they listening to? And for you and me, if you haven't caught it yet, it was there in the beginning. Whose voice did they listen to? And every week that we come to this story and this pattern, it's this. Whose voice are they listening to? And for you and me, whose voice are we listening to? And this promise of God gathering them again, it goes to, even if they're scattered to the farthest parts of the earth, God is going to gather them so that you will love the Lord your God. So God wants to gather them and bring them together, bring them to himself, so that they might have a home together. He wants them to experience home with him. From the beginning, he wanted to create a home with humans. And even though they keep rejecting him and doing evil and ruining the place that he created, and he still wants to create a home with them. And so Moses goes on, see, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. If life and good, death and evil, if you obey. It's that same word of listen. It's listen and follow. Then you shall live and multiply. Look here. He is calling the Genesis 1, you shall live and multiply. Here, increase in number, fill, fruitful. You shall live and multiply, and he will bless you in the land. These blessings in this land are supposed to be the blessings in that land. But if you will not hear, if you will not hear, you shall surely perish. Look at those two phrases. You shall surely die. You shall surely perish. It's basically an exact quote of the same thing. It's like the blessings are promised. Here I'm setting them before you. And if you don't listen to his voice, you're going to surely die. You will surely die. And he sets this before them, and he says, choose life. Here is the warning. Life is possible for you. It is set before you. The blessings that God wants to give in you and through you to the entire earth. It's set before you. Choose life. We've seen this before. Like if you're journeying with us in this pattern, this is not the first time we have seen this play out. Every step along the journey, God comes to a group of people and he sets before them these blessings and he says, I want to bless you. Listen to me and you will live and experience my blessings. But if you don't, you will surely die. And so then as we jump into this story, there's two parts to this. Up here is the human part of the story, historical human reasons, like the king of Israel rebels against the king of Assyria, and so he comes down and carries the Israelites away to Assyria. And so the human aspect of it, here's the exile, because one king rebelled against another king and was treacherous. This smaller king rebelled against the big evil empire king, and the big evil empire king and came down and said, you are smaller than me and you are now mine. The rest of this communicates the God piece of it. And so the author is like, and this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against their God. So this captivity and thing that happened in human history, this author is fully convinced this happened because these people had sinned and rebelled against God. And so it's like, okay, the people of Israel sinned against God and rejected him. And there's so many things that they did. So here's a few things they did secretly. They hid from God and tried to do things in secret against him, hide their rebellion from him. They built for themselves things. This pillars of Asherim, that's like a foreign god, a different god. And think of it like this. If you were married to somebody, like God commits himself to this group of people like two human people commit themselves to each other in a marriage. And these people constantly betray that relationship, and they made offerings and did wicked things. And yet God was patient, and God sent warnings, multiple warnings, and he was patient, and he said, look, if you keep not listening to me, you are going to be taken away. There is punishment coming. And they would not listen. But they would not listen. To God constantly bringing warning to them, they would not listen. They despised what he said. They followed the people around them, nations around them. And they got to this place where they had gone so far away from how God thought about this world and his definition of good and evil, to a place where they defined it to be good to burn their sons and daughters as offerings. How gross is it? And how far away from God's definition of good and evil? This is a picture of the progression of evil that stacks up on itself. When you constantly not listen to God and refuse to listen to him and follow other voices, that stacks on itself, and you get to this place that you never thought you would be. I'm sure these people never thought to themselves, I want someday to get to this place where I am burning my son and daughter in the fire to a foreign god, and I rejoice and celebrate it because we're doing something good to a God. Therefore, the Lord was angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. Sometimes we can read these stories and we're like, how can God be a part of sending a foreign nation to conquer these people? And when you see a statement like this, his people, that society, had gotten to the place where they thought it was a good thing to sacrifice other human beings. God needed to step in and say, this needs to stop and something has to change. And so You do not get to live in that place anymore. And so get out of my sight so that this evil can stop and this needs to change. And so Israel was exiled from their land. Now, we've already talked that these can be uncomfortable things and realities. And I want you guys to go into your small groups and talk about both pictures in Deuteronomy, that this life and blessing being set before the people, and what happens to a group of people when they continually reject God's voice and listen to other people's voices. Have fun. Peace.